Tom Maguire, so I'm just going to do a quick review on The Pleasure of Finding Things Out, Richard Feynman. So this is basically a collection of Richard Feynman's work, printed articles, interviews, speeches, lectures, all put together in this really interesting book. It was published in 1999. He died in 1988. He's a Nobel Prize winning physicist. He was involved in developing the atomic bomb. He was involved in investigating the Challenger disaster in 1986. And that was really where I'd already known about Richard Feynman. There's a semi-autobiographical book called Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, which I'd heard about before. Funny enough, I'd heard it through sort of personal development type circles online and things. But that's meant to be really, really good, really good. And I intend to read that at some point, or listen to it, depending. But it's just really, really interesting, this book. He's such a significant character, such a significant person from history, that it's one that I really recommend. He was involved, like I say, with the atomic bomb and with the Challenger disaster investigation. So a really significant person and just really interesting. And like I say, I was inspired to read this or to listen to this on Audible because I watched the Challenger disaster documentary on Netflix, and I've always found that quite an interesting thing anyway. But watching, being reminded of it by Netflix and watching it again, I just find that sort of thing so fascinating. I find things like that, kind of prove the point that fact is stranger than fiction. I just kind of think it just seems so bizarre, doesn't it, when you think about the space race? I still can't quite get my head around the fact that we landed on the moon in 1969 and all that technology. And so I've watched loads of space stuff recently off the back of this. And then, of course, the Challenger went up in 1986 and exploded. Technically, it wasn't actually an explosion. Fuel caught on fire or something. And yeah, but anyway, that's worth looking into. So the Challenger disaster itself is worth looking into, actually. The really interesting documentary, horrible, but it just kind of almost far enough in the past that it just feels kind of eerily familiar, but just haunting and strange and kind of, yeah, a really important lesson, basically, when it comes to personal development, when it comes to our arrogance as human beings, how we think that we're so kind of in control of technology and the things that we know. And that's what's really interesting about this book. Richard Feynman really talks throughout the whole book about the fact that we need to stay open-minded, that physicists tend to see things quite kind of in quite a concrete way, I suppose. And he's basically saying that we owe it to future generations to keep an open mind and to understand that we're not always right. We are often wrong, and we need to be prepared to accept that and to learn and to move on and to innovate and keep creating. As soon as we have a closed-minded opinion of things, we start, as soon as we believe our own hype and that we're all-powerful, that we know things for certain, that's when we scupper things. That's when future generations miss out potentially, because we're holding back the potential to kind of learn and develop things. So we're slowing the process down just through human arrogance, really, which I think is a really important message for personal development. Anyone interested in personal development, and I just enjoyed this book from a reading for the sake of reading or listening for the sake of listening point of view. It was just really enjoyable, just really interesting stuff. He just seems to be a really interesting, charismatic guy, or was. It's basically, he talks about a lot of practical, interesting conversations he had with his dad growing up, and he says his dad wasn't a scientist, but he really enjoyed science and kind of was learning about it, and he helped him appreciate it. And he says how his dad used to explain things in a really interesting way. There was no pressure to perform or to kind of learn to any sort of standard or anything like that. It was just, he would ask questions of his dad, and his dad would explain things in a really kind of interesting way. He'd talk about where certain things came from, and he'd take it right back to the fact that energy comes from the sun, from the heat from the sun causes things to grow. And yeah, but the way he talks about it is just really, really interesting, really articulate, really nice to listen to. Some real nice imagery in this book, which I think is important. So Richard Feynman was also, he was a prime mover in quantum computing, development of quantum computing. He introduced the concept of nanotechnology, so having a tiny doctor go inside your system and be able to work on things. He gives a story about when he saw the atomic bomb go off, and he says that everyone was watching behind these really dark glasses and things, and they couldn't see it properly. And he was like, he just went behind a truck windshield because he knew that ultraviolet light couldn't go through couldn't go through glass. So, he says that brightness isn't what damages our eyes, it's ultraviolet light. So he just watched it through the glass, and he says he was probably the only person to have actually seen it properly because of that, which was quite a nice little story. He says that we don't know what the meaning of life is, and that's a really interesting question. He says that the British have got a good way of looking at things in the sense that we just muddle through, and he says actually muddling through is quite a scientific way of doing things. He says, scientists like to think that they're very kind of, they know exactly what they're doing quite clinically and confidently, but actually a lot of it is muddling through, is kind of just testing stuff and trying and making mistakes. And that's just so true of personal development, isn't it? That we need to, if we're ever going to innovate and improve, we need to try things and learn as we go to a certain extent. The audio version, the audible version, is narrated by Sean Runnett, who is someone who I absolutely loved in another book. I can't remember which book it was that he was in now. I'll edit it in afterwards for your reference. But I listened to a book recently on Audible and I was raving about the narrator, and I said that I would look out for another book narrated by him. And it just happened, I found this one. I didn't even realise until I started listening to it. It was the same guy, really, really great voice, Sean Runnett. But yeah, he also talks, I did a bit of research on Dr. Richard Feynman, and when he died, he kind of said how, I think one of his colleagues was looking sad, and he asked them why they were looking sad, and they sort of said to him, because I don't think you've got very, very long sort of thing. And he said, yeah, well, that concerns me as well. But he said, when you've written as many stories or told as many stories as I have and things, and written as much stuff as I've done, then a part of me is going to live on, kind of thing, which is quite nice, I think. Shows the kind of slightly vain side of human nature, I suppose, and that we like to think will be remembered when we're gone. But, I think that's fairly normal as well, and natural. And actually, if you can be remembered for doing things the right way, then fantastic. So good on him, basically. He was also quoted as saying, I'd hate to die twice, it's so boring, which I thought was quite funny as well. So yeah, the concept of death obviously being a big one for everyone, but it's kind of nice to hear these kind of genius types kind of with their view on that as well. So yeah, it's just a really good book. I'm not going to give any sort of spoilers away. Like I say, it's just a collection of his works, told in a real kind of just intelligent, eloquent, jovial sort of. He just strikes me as someone who doesn't take himself too seriously, even though he's incredibly talented. He knew exactly what he was doing. Like I say, he's a Nobel Prize physicist. I think he was recently considered to be the top 5 physicists of all time in some kind of physicist poll, whatever it was. And yeah, if you see any kind of footage of him, he just seems like a charismatic guy, just very unique, very kind of very individual. And that's what we're always told in personal development, isn't it? To be ourselves, to be unique. And he comes across like that, as a bit of an eccentric, but just kind of full of energy and passion for what it is that he does. And he says that a lot in the book. He says that a few times in the book, that he's a physicist. He's not very good at, he doesn't think he's very good at other stuff. He was also known for being really good on the bongos, apparently he was really quite good at that. And had a real talent for that, apparently. But I just really enjoyed this book. It was a bit like I suppose the A.A. Gill Far and Away one, in the sense that it's just really interesting to listen to someone so intelligent and articulate and able to tell stories in such an interesting way. You can just kind of escape through this kind of thing. I think so. For me, it's non-fiction, and it's about learning and improving my knowledge and kind of taking advice from someone who's been there and done it to a certain extent. But it's not that I don't listen to this kind of book and sit there with a pen writing notes constantly. I listen to a book like this and I soak it up and I enjoy it, and I have a feeling of kind of well-being from listening to this kind of book. And I think that's really important as well when it comes to reading and listening to books. I don't care if you read a book or you listen to a book. I don't think they're two different experiences. I tend to be listening to a book and reading a book at the same time. I tend to get through a couple of books a week, roughly, about 100 books a year, something like that. Which, to be fair, is potentially a little bit too much. I always say every year that I'll probably wind it down a little bit and try and take my time a little bit more. But I think the pace that I read at is kind of okay for me. I feel like I have reasonable comprehension at that speed. And I think because audiobooks are so easily accessible, it does just make it that much. It does increase your ability to get through more. But I enjoy both in different ways. There's a lot of snobbery around audiobooks, and I think it's really unnecessary. I think I consider myself to be as competent a reader as anyone, really. But if I choose to listen to an audiobook instead of read one, that doesn't mean I can't read. That just means I want to listen to it. I think it's a different kind of experience. But I think you get, listening is a really important skill. Most of us don't listen anything like as good as well as we should do. most of us, when we talk about empathetic listening or empathic listening, we're generally trying to think about what we're going to say next rather than actually listening to what the person's saying to us when we're in a conversation. And I think we tend to do that a little bit when we're listening to information as well. We need to calm our minds down and kind of soak up information properly and take it in properly. And it's the same with reading. I can be reading in bed sometimes. If I'm tired, I might start to switch off potentially, and I have to remind myself that, carry on for a little while, but if you can't, then just go to sleep and start again tomorrow, because there's no point in reading for the sake of it or listening for the sake of it. But the point is, I just really enjoy some of these books. I just find them really absorbing and inspiring, and I just love to learn about these kind of people. So Dr. Richard Feynman, I think he's fantastic. I'll be reading more of his stuff. Highly recommend it. It's a really good read. Cheers. See you next time.